Nation. So let's thank Rajiv Vinnakota.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and good morning, or I guess at this point it's a good afternoon. Thanks to the department for inviting me to speak today and for your hospitality. I especially enjoyed last night the impromptu tour of the U of A at about midnight, which I assume is not a tour that everyone is lucky enough to have, and I really enjoyed it. As was mentioned, I'm a scientist by training, so I'd like to start by talking about inventions. Inventions, by definition, are new, but usually, almost always, inventions are based and built on old models, old assumptions, and something that existed before. For example, Gutenberg's printing press was derived from the already existing machines for pressing grapes or driving whey from cheese. That's my Wisconsin connection there. And similarly, Seed's boarding school model, though not as world-changing as the printing press, draws on experiences and elements of models which came long before our organization's existence when we started in 1997. Because boarding schools have really a long history and an established role in American K-12 education. Now, traditionally and overwhelmingly, that role has been confined to private schools, the Phillips Exeter, Phillips Andover type of model, and they served a very specific role when they were established. Schools built to bring together the best and the brightest Protestants or Catholics and create networks to prepare them to get into the best universities in the country. Or alternatively, or maybe an overlap, schools that were set up to take wayward sons of wealthy families and where they could go get reformed and straightened out before they went to college. The general stereotype, the separate piece type of stereotype of boarding schools, both the ethos for the college preparatory learning environment with a strong faculty, but also on the other hand, the symbol of wealthy elitism probably came from there. But what people may not know is that there's also a deep history of black boarding schools. Nearly 100 black boarding schools existed in the United States before the 1960s, mainly in southern states, where these independent boarding schools have been made, were a significant part of the educational infrastructure. Local blacks, religious institutions, organizations, philanthropists took it upon themselves to build these independent elementary and secondary boarding schools. And after the civil rights movement, many of these schools closed because of increasing demand for decreasing demand after desegregation. And today, only 4 of those schools remain. But the idea of boarding schools serving the at-risk or underserved population also has gone in and out of the public discourse. Probably the best one of which, best known, is the Milton Hershey School. I don't know how many people have heard of that school in Hershey, Pennsylvania. It was founded in 1909 by Milton Hershey and his wife, Catherine. They endowed the school with half of their wealth. In fact, the Milton Hershey School owns half of Hershey Foods. And over the years, it started out initially as a vocational school for male orphans in a rural setting, and has grown since then now to be a college preparatory school that's also co-ed. And the student body at Milton Hershey has also always been defined as a needy body. Students must be from low-income families. A preference is given to students who come from the state of Pennsylvania, but there's another 20% who come from all over the country. And there's a selective admission criteria, both the low-income criteria, but also that there are students who want to learn, and they must not have had a history of behavioral or emotional issues. Milton Hershey serves 1,800 children in grade K through 12 on about 500 acres, most gorgeous land in Pennsylvania. You can do that when your endowment is $6.5 billion and you own half of Hershey Foods. And they also have an operating budget of, roughly speaking, $65,000 per student per year. Not surprisingly, there are no tuition or fees that are charged at the school. A lesser-known model, but actually older, is Girard College in Philadelphia. Stephen Girard founded it actually in 1833. It was established as a privately run school for male orphans. And when Stephen Girard passed away, he was actually the richest man in America. and endowed this school. It has an endowment roughly of only $450 to $500 million, serves about 550 students, both boys and girls, in grades 1 through 12. That school requires that all children must be from low-income single-parent households. And it's also college preparatory in nature. Another model you don't really talk about when you talk about boarding schools, but certainly applies, are orphanages. While there's a major social stigma now around orphanages, in many cases they were institutions for children who had literally nowhere to go and could be taken care of. And education was a secondary aspect, but certainly part of that model and value proposition. In the mid-90s, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich actually brought this idea back to the forefront when he suggested and floated a proposal to take poor single mothers off of welfare and instead spend that money to send their children to orphanages. He was, not surprisingly, criticized for this just a little bit. The idea didn't go anywhere, but for those of us who were thinking about public boarding schools, it made it much more difficult because the O question always came up whenever we had conversations. And the final historical underpinning that I just want to point out, which is not as positive, is that the history of boarding schools for Native Americans. In the late 19th century, Native American children were taken almost all forcibly from their families and put into boarding schools. The idea was to teach them Victorian ideals and culture and get them to more comfortably assimilate into the major American society and culture. Girls were taught to sew and cook, boys were taught how to farm, and this flew in the face of very often the matriarchal societies that were set up or established in Native American societies. And it was such a poor policy that by 2005, actually in the 109th Congress, Congresswoman Jo Davis in Virginia actually introduced and got a joint resolution passed that literally included an apology for, quote, the forcible removal of Native children from their families to faraway boarding schools where their native practices and languages were degraded and forbidden. And so to this day, the idea of boarding schools generates strong and, not surprisingly, very negative visceral views from many Native Americans. So the reason that I wanted to give you this history is to kind of let you know that, you know what, this invention, this idea really isn't new. The idea of a boarding school isn't new. The idea of a tuition-free boarding school, or even for that matter, tuition-free boarding school for at-risk children or at-risk populations, is not a new conversation. These are old assumptions that form the basis for what we wanted to do. What is new is that the local public boarding school model has now started to become part of the larger conversation of what role it should have, most specifically in urban education reform, but you could even then place it and talk about it even in general education and rural education as well. And that's the issue that I intend to discuss today. I'm going to both tell you from our experience of starting 2 college preparatory urban public boarding schools what we have done, and then intend to make the case for why this needs to be part of the national conversation and national solution. So I'm going to walk you through not only the theoretical underpinning of why it's needed, but how we've developed it, how it's worked to date, and what needs to be done to serve more students. All in enough time to then allow you to come up and talk about yourself for another 10 or 15 minutes. So, keep me on the clock. So let me start out with the conversation around the why, which is the theoretical underpinning for the public boarding school model. And really start that by talking about the comprehensive continuum of offerings. And I'm going to apologize as a start that I'm going to go through not that many slides today. They're going to be very dense. I'm going to give you a few comments, and if we want to come back to them, more than willing to have a longer conversation. Part of what we think of as the solution set for education reform has to acknowledge that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and that different children have different needs. If you look at this continuum, what you see on the left side is the traditional school, strengthened day school program that serves a group of kids, all the way to the right for the year-round immersion, what we would call residential treatment, really for highly special needs children, and a 365-day-a-year type of program. and that there's a set of resource allocations from what you have now all the way to one that talks about 365 days a year. And that in this model, you can go all the way from strengthened day schools to additional after-school extended day program. But what's missing is this idea of a boarding school. The idea that for some kids, that their needs are so great that they need to be in a 24-hour environment that is safe, secure, nurturing, that also provides them the additional time and also, in some ways, protects them from some of the other challenges that they face. And what those childs may need is everything from a student whose mother might be on public assistance, who has problems housing her family, facing serious health issues, and so on, to parents who are incarcerated, living away from home, to some of children who are in child welfare, pulled out by Child Protective Services, and so on and so forth. We know from our own experiences of 14 years of running the school in D.C. that when you're able to take some of these children, provide them these set of resources, that they can do just as well as anyone in this room. We have children who attend some of the top colleges and universities in the country. I'm thinking of one right now who has a mother who's on welfare, who has moved from home to home, whose brother was shot and paralyzed when she was young. She was able to come to seed in a great environment, flourished with all the resources that we were able to provide to her, and now is a sophomore at Ohio Wesleyan University in a year abroad program in Tanzania, and is also double majoring. So that is just one example of the types of students that we want to be able to serve. A second part of this theoretical underpinning is the idea of a more efficient allocation of resources. A boarding school is able to bring many different resources, right, beyond just what you would call education, mentoring and tutoring, enrichment, college counseling and readiness, nutrition, health services, housing, general other social services, along with the challenging academic program. It's a comprehensive type of wraparound services. And bringing it under one roof actually ends up making it more efficient. You don't have to have families going different places to try to get those services and maybe not have the time to get all of those services filled. It's a poor allocation of resources to have to try to set up systems for every one of these silos rather than try to bring it under one roof. The mission orientation may not be aligned. That is, a program focused on nutrition may just worry about the nutrition of the child, but may not think about holistically about what's in the child's best interest in the long term. Certainly, you can assume that most of these programs are not about poverty alleviation, they're just about maintenance, right? All of these types of programs end up actually driving misallocation of resources. And in fact, we did an analysis a few years ago looking at the state of Maryland, which is where we have our second seed school, and basically said, what are all the existing public assistance programs and services that are already going to the children that we're serving? And let's line them up and how much do they cost, as opposed to a cost of a seed school, a boarding school. And you end up seeing that not only are we already spending the resources, but we're actually spending them at a higher cost basis than if we do it under one roof. And this doesn't even take into account the arguments around mission orientation and outcomes, which we'll talk about later. The third and final argument and theoretical argument for why it's important to have boarding schools is what we call internally the gift of time. High-performing schools, be they charter or traditional public schools, but certainly you're seeing it with high-performance charter schools, have been able to successfully extend the day and extend the year. Well, we're the ultimate extension of the day. And being able to have 24 hours a day provides us with the ability to have 2 hours of study hall at night so that we can focus on other things during the day where the teachers are there. But the additional allure of the gift of time is what else we can teach. What other skills, social skills, non-cognitive skills development that we can provide because we have students for a much longer time. And things like learning to live away from home, being able to live in a dormitory, being able to reinforce good study habits, good life habits, etiquette lessons, issue resolution, mediation, all of those things that we're able to do because we have our children for a longer time becomes really important. Connected to that is more access to role models. You have RAs living on campus, all of them college graduates, many of them coming from similar economic and backgrounds and circumstances as the students that we're serving, being able to provide not only life lessons but also a helping hand, being able to be that older brother or sister, as well as sometimes a parent, as well as sometimes the mentor. That is the gift of time that we talk about at the Seed School that you're able to have because you have your students 24 hours a day. So that's a theoretical underpinning. What I'd like to do now is apply that to what we did in starting the Seed Schools and give you a little bit of history and background on Seed. The Seed idea really started as a brainchild of two people, my business partner Eric Adler and myself, who came up with the idea separately. I came up with the idea, believe it or not, while drinking a beer with 4 of my college classmates 1 year after graduation, while I was loving my job as a management consultant, but also knowing it's not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And also deciding that I didn't want to spend 9 years to go back and get an MD, PhD to try to solve the AIDS crisis. And so I said, well, what are other issues that I could think about? My parents are both educators. My dad's a professor at Marquette University. My mother used to be a second-grade teacher. And so we started talking about education that evening and focused pretty rapidly on urban education. And one of my friends just asked a simple question. He said, there's boarding schools for privileged kids. What about those most in need? Pretty simple question. And for the next 2 years, I just kind of walked around with that thought in my head. And finally, in 1996, I actually took a leave of absence from the consulting firm where I was working and traveled around the country for 2 months because I simply said, you can't tell me 5 of us drinking a beer were the first ones to think of this idea. And so I spent time at traditional boarding schools and also talking to all kinds of policymakers and educators. And during those 2 months, not only met a number of people who had an interest in this idea, but with a fairly distinct answer to why aren't there boarding schools? And the answer wasn't because of some theoretical question, but much more the practical question. How do we end up actually paying for it? And so I then brought together this group of people, it ended up being about 12 people, together for a weekend to think more clearly about, well, how do we make this happen? Is it possible? It was there that Eric Adler and I, after we spent this weekend together, basically decided that we thought we could pull this off. And both of us decided to go to our respective companies and gave notice the next day. And 2.5 weeks later started working full-time in March 1st of 1997 with the intention of opening a school 18 months later, which was the craziest thing I've ever done in my life. And that we did. In July of 1998, opening the nation's first urban public boarding school, the Seed School of Washington, D.C. A little bit about what the school is. It's a grade 6 through 12 school with the only entry being at the 6th grade. And it's boarding in the sense that it's a 5-day boarding program. Our students come on campus on Sunday night and stay with us through Friday afternoon and then go home for the weekends. And it's urban in that it's located in the community that we serve. 75% of the students that we serve in D.C. come from a 6-mile radius. That's on purpose. We didn't want to be taking children and having them go hundreds of miles away to go to the school. We wanted to be in the community and with the families that we were serving. It's public, and that publicness really comes from 2 places. The funding streams, which I'll talk about in a moment, but also in terms of access. So we literally have a lottery. We pick lottery balls out of a hat. Every year I call Lottery Day the happiest and saddest day of the year. For me, we average anywhere from 2 to 5 times as many applicants as we have slots. And it's college preparatory. We believe that every one of our students, if given the opportunities, can successfully go through a college preparatory program. We have about 15% of our students who have special needs. We believe that they can do the same. We don't have students at the high end of needs. In Washington, D.C., there are 5 levels, and we serve students in levels 1, 2, and 3. But we've been able to send students off to college at the same rate with special needs as we're sending the rest of our students. So, as I was talking before, this boarding school model is really the same structure as the boarding schools I've talked about. The only difference is who we serve and where we serve them. So these 18 months of work that we did from March 1st of 1997 to the summer of 1998 really focused first and foremost on the question I raised before, which is how do we fund a boarding school? Because boarding schools by definition are more expensive than day schools. It ends up that the cost for a traditional boarding school, if you go to the National Association of Independent Schools and look at the numbers, ends up being about $45,000 per student per year. Now, that cost doesn't even take in all the depreciation of the assets that has been around for hundreds of years and so. So it ends up that the cost is even actually much higher than that. We've been able to drive the seed school cost down to about $35,000 to $37,000 per student per year when we get to capacity. And the real key cost drivers on the boarding side are the additional faculty and staff. You have people who live on campus plus additional people who provide support who may not live on campus, and that ends up actually costing about $8,000 per student per year in additional cost. The occupancy cost, that's both the cost of building the buildings and also the food and so on and so forth. Additional student support services, and administration and the debt service for what we have to build. What we were able to do in Washington, D.C. Was to literally change the funding formula for public boarding schools. And the best way to talk about this is to really kind of give you a couple stories. The way that the D.C. funding formula is set up for all public schools is that the federal government has set up the mechanism for how the formula is set up. And that law drives how the traditional public schools as well as the charter schools are funded. In looking at those laws, we basically came to the realization that there were two exceptions that the federal government allowed for students to receive more money. One was special needs students, and the other was for English as a second language. We asked a simple question. Why not create a third exception for boarding students? And then we went and got the amendment. What we did is we literally inserted authorizing language that allows the D.C. City Council and the mayor to provide additional funding, if they so desire, for public boarding students. And then went back to the City Council and negotiated into the statutory formula what that number looks like. So how does that get applied here? The average per pupil funding, and this is kind of gross average, you have to take into account middle school, high school, so on and so forth, special ed, that's all average in there, is about $12,000 per student per year in the District of Columbia. On top of that, there's about $1,000 of additional revenue that comes in from No Child Left Behind, other parts of the federal government funding. The boarding add-on is actually a multiplier. In the statutory formula is a line that says that if a student is attending a boarding school, they receive an additional 1.7x, where x is defined as that core per pupil funding. And so what you see is that you're able to actually create this additional funding stream. We do some private fundraising, but it basically gets you to $34,000, $35,000 per student per year. And that, because it's indexed to the per pupil funding, which is indexed to inflation, allows us to grow over time. That's what it looked like in 1998 and 1999. It's now up to a much higher level as a result of its indexing. It allows us to also run and operate a school that can, at capacity, be self-sustaining. Based on this, we're then able to open the school, starting with 40 students in 1998, and have grown to now serving 330 students in grades 6 through 12. One of the questions, of course, is going back to the theoretical issue, are we serving the kids that we wanted to talk about on that solution spectrum? And the answer is, we can't be selective. We're a charter school in D.C. And so part of what we've had to do is a lot of target marketing. We're located in Southeast D.C. in literally a school that had been torched 25 times the 2 years before we came on the campus and rebuilt it. Where, unfortunately, in 1993, well before we were there, a 5-year-old girl had been shot and killed through stray gang gunfire. It is in one of the toughest sections of town. It is also an oasis. we're able to go to families around there and say, this is a school that's still in your community, but can provide this 24-hour program. We can go to church leaders, community leaders, guidance counselors, and say, you know the children who could really benefit from being in a 24-hour environment. We're stacking the deck in the lottery, but we can't be selective. What we know, generally speaking, from a demographic overview, is that 85% of our students report no parent with a college degree. 80% live with a single parent or no parent, and 75% are Title I eligible. That starts to get at the type of students that we're trying to serve. Then, 10 years later, in 2008, we opened our second school, the Seed School of Maryland, located in Baltimore. And I want to talk a little bit about that operating funding stream because it looks a little bit different. In Maryland, we're not a charter school. Maryland has a very weak charter law, and after working with the state legislature to try to figure out how to fund the school, we came to the realization that we would have to do it differently. And so we ended up passing standalone legislation for the Maryland Boarding Education Program that sets up a funding program in the following way. We have to draw kids from all over the state who meet certain at-risk criteria. And then once those students are in the lottery, we do the same thing we do in DC. We pick the students out of this eligible pool. We then get 85% of the sending district's cost. So in Baltimore, the sending district spends $12,000 per student per year. On the Eastern Shore, they spend $6,500 per student per year. We get 85% of that. Then the state, through its general funds, appropriates $25,000 per student per year on top of that for the boarding program. We do some private donations, and then we're able to fund the program that way. Now, how were we able to do that? First, we had to be able to tell all the state legislators that people in their district would have access to the school, right? Or they wouldn't vote for it. Second, unlike the DC school, the legislature was pretty blunt in saying, look, we don't want students who could do fine without the boarding program to actually get into your school. So how do we create criteria to make that happen? And so in law is a designation that all children who attend the seed school, the school under this program, have to be both disadvantaged and at risk. The disadvantage criteria is a poverty indicator. And then the at-risk criteria are defined in contract between the operator, in this case the Seed School of Maryland, and the State Department of Education. And what we've done is set up a number of factors where every student has to meet at least two of those factors to be eligible. Let me just list some of them off for you. Having a record of suspensions, failing to succeed academically behind both in reading and math, living in foster care, having an incarcerated parent, having a disability. And it ends up that actually a majority of our students, because these variables are very much connected, end up having more than two of those factors to be eligible. And just to say this again, we're not a charter school in Maryland. What we are is a state-funded public boarding school, where our authorizer is the State Department of Education. So in this school, we're starting to get closer to knowing that we're serving the students that we want to on our solution spectrum by these definitions. We know that a third of our student body have a parent member who's incarcerated. We know that 85% of them don't have a parent with a college degree. 25% of them are involved with the social service system. And we opened in 2008 with 86 graders, and we're now growing the school by adding a 6th grade class every year. So right now we're at 240 students, growing to 400 students. So how have we done? I'd say pretty well. In terms of college outcomes, which for us is the ultimate measure, and especially when you look at the Seed School of DC, which has had 6 graduating classes, 91% of our students who enter the 9th grade graduate from high school. 70% of them graduate from seed, and pretty much every one of them is accepted and goes on to college. Another 21% don't stay with us, but because we track them, we know that they've graduated from high school, and some of them have gone on to college. That compares to 33% high school graduation rate in Wards 7 and 8, which is where we draw almost all of our students. 43% high school graduation rate for DC Public Schools, And then nationally, I think it's about 68, 70%. 87% of SEED's first 7 graduating classes have enrolled immediately in college. That's compared to nationally only 56% of African Americans high school graduates enrolling immediately. And 82% of our students are the first in their family to enroll in college. Lastly, SEED students stay in college. What we know in looking at the 6-year rate is that our students are graduating at a rate about 3 times of the rate where we're located. That number, unfortunately, is not where we want it to be. That number is 33%. What we do know is that currently 59% of our graduates are on track progressing towards college graduation within 6 years. That compares, just to give you an idea, to 11% for low-income first-generation students graduating from college in 6 years. And the reason we think that, that we're successful is not only because of the program that we provide in high school, but because we have a college transition and support program. When you're the first in your family to go to college, being able to pick up the phone and talk to someone who can support you and provide you all kinds of aid is really, really important. I'm fond of telling the story that my first semester at college, after being a big fish in that little pond of Nicolet High School in Milwaukee, I go off to college and I take the advanced chemistry course, and my first test, I get a 33. And I walk back to my dorm room thinking, I don't know if I can hack it. And so pick up the phone, I call my dad, and my dad talks me through the test and what I did to prepare for it and what I've learned from it and what I'm going to do next time. And he says, okay, so are we good? I say, yeah, okay. He says, okay, go have some lunch. Oh, and by the way, don't tell your mom about this conversation. I'm like, sure. My dad's a college professor, right? He can take me through that. You need to make sure that every student has some kind of access and some kind of support so that when they inevitably get that 33 or have some issue, that they have the support services so that they can talk it through with someone that they trust. So our standardized tests test scores are also growing. Just to give you an idea for the class of 2014, prior to enrolling at CDC, 5% of them were at reading level or above. 44% of them were at 3rd grade reading level or below. By the end of the 8th grade year, 70% of them were at grade level or above. So per the theoretical argument, we're starting to see some of these numbers. For us, almost as important, or even more importantly, is seeing some of the key social and non-academic outcomes. We have significantly lower rates of drug use, of juvenile incarceration or connection with the juvenile system, much lower teen pregnancy, those kinds of things that we think over the long term will have as much or even a greater impact in terms of societal outcomes as the academic outcomes that we're seeing with the students that we serve. Lastly, is we've had an unintended and very positive consequence on the families that we serve. SEED has really become an intermediary for supporting the families, many of them who are in danger of being separated by the social service agencies. I'm sorry, let me be clear. Not that many of our families are, but we have been successful with many of the families who are dealing with that. Because Child Protective Services knows us so well, they get to be very comfortable that we can work with the parent, with the child, to provide the support services necessary so that the Child Protective Services do not have to necessarily pull the child out of the homes. And we've been successful on a number of occasions in being able to do that. In addition to that, anecdotal information from the first few graduating classes has told us that about 25% of our parents end up going back to work on their GED or going to community colleges. 80% of our parents end up participating in job workshop, volunteer opportunities that we give at the school, and 90% of our parents actively work with their child through the college application process because we provide all those services and all of that training. So ironically enough, parents end up being more engaged despite the fact that their children are going to a boarding school. This is partly a function of providing a variety of workshops, but I also want to point out that what we've learned is that there's absolutely no correlation between previous parental engagement at the elementary school and their level of engagement once they come to seed. So that gives you an overview of what we've been able to do to date. The challenges to open a single urban public boarding school, much less many, are considerable. And for those of you who read the Logue report, which was part of what I sent with Misty, you'll see that there were a number of other schools that attempted to open about roughly the same time and closed. We are lucky to be able to point to a number of things. A very strong board that we were able to develop. Having a 15-year charter in DC was also great, as opposed to a 4 or 5-year charter, so that we had a longer time frame to be able to develop the things that we wanted. We enrolled 1 grade per year. Now, that may seem obvious and the right thing to do, but let me hasten to point out that there's significant financial consequences to being subscale for 6 years. It means you have to do a lot of private fundraising to meet that gap until you get to capacity. And our board, which was strong enough and understood how important this was, allowed us to do that and allowed us to grow the school deliberately rather than trying to have to get to size and scale immediately. But you always have to go back to the understanding that getting the financial model and the sustainable operating financial model was exceedingly important. Let me also point out three challenges which are consistent with other schools that are starting. Right? One is finding great leadership. And we have had difficulties doing that over time. We're now in our 14th year. We have a great head of school at the DC school. But we're on our 5th head of school. And one of the things that we've realized is part of it is about getting better at knowing what we need, but part of it is also about creating systems so that our heads of school would burn out in 2 years. Creating a managing director position who would take all of the operating responsibilities and oversight so that the head of school can really focus on children and outcomes. The other part of it is, frankly, when we started in 1997, the pool of leaders wasn't as strong as it is now. There are many, many more people who are engaged in education reform, many more people who want to be leaders. There's other mechanisms, New Leaders for New Schools, the Kid Fisher Fellows programs, other mechanisms where we can identify potential great leaders. Secondly is, of course, the private fundraising. It's a challenge for everyone. One of the things that we've been able to do is create a very interesting value proposition. What you see on this page, don't try to read it, just trust me, is that the dark portion is the private fundraising and the cream portion is the public funds. So we go out and try to get the sustainable stream of funding up front so that we can demonstrate, as you can see on the back end, a sustainable funding stream that comes from public coffers. Now, that's very difficult to do. But once you can do that, you can then go back to private donors and even in this case banks for the debt and say, yes, we are coming to you to raise significant dollars. But here's our promise to you. 5 years from now, we're not going to come and say, we need $1 million now or the school ceases to exist. And that's been critical, not only in both schools where we've been able to float tax-exempt debt financing, $25 million in the Seed School of Maryland, $14 million at the Seed School of DC, but we've now raised a total of $85 million in private fundraising to be able to build the capital and grow the schools. In many instances for people who weren't involved in education reform initially, but who saw this model and saw it as an interesting investment upfront of many, many dollars, but one where they wouldn't have to come back year over year to ensure the existence of the school. There are, of course, always challenges with site identification, and in our case, it's even greater, right? We're lucky in that Seed School of DC is located on 4 acres, but it's next to a 15-acre public recreation center. We were lucky that there was a comprehensive public high school in Baltimore that was closing, so we got a 52-acre campus for a 99-year lease at $1 a year. We had to negotiate all those things, but we were able to find a lot of those sites and to be able to have enough space to build dormitories and so on. I'll finish with 2 other challenges. One is that the human capital question becomes even more difficult for us because of the boarding staff. So we have an academic faculty that looks like a traditional academic teaching corps, but we also have a boarding faculty. And there aren't easy places to go to find great boarding faculty. We end up having to go and look for people who have masters or interest in social work and child development, teachers and so on who come, but there isn't some place where we know that the pool of candidates is strong and you can just continue to pull. You have to do all the due diligence. You have to figure out what are the leading indicators and so on. And we have to develop a plan, a very developed plan over time of professional development to make that work. The second is one of those things that you really never think about until you actually try to run a boarding school. And this has to do with management and human capital. So let's assume for a moment that there's a student who didn't do his or her homework. And the academic faculty member says, you know what, I want you to come in after school and spend an hour with me and we're going to finish this. Well, at the same time that you've pulled that child to work on the academic program is a student life skills program going on in the boarding program. And you have just pulled the child out of that. And you have implicitly, well actually almost explicitly in this case, suggested that the academic outcomes are more important than these non-cognitive life skills outcomes. Well, guess what? That doesn't make this faculty very happy. And so you have to figure out how you create an equal program, one that understands that you need to have both developed, one that then also compensates both faculties adequately, one that shows and sends the messages that all of the faculty are important. I'll just give you a very simple idea here about how even verbiage becomes so important. For many years, our boarding faculty were called staff, and our academic faculty was called faculty. Not surprisingly, our boarding staff didn't like that. So it's our boarding faculty, right? They're teaching and educating the students that we have just as much as the faculty is during the day. But learning and thinking about all of those things, in many ways, you only really learn them as you're making those mistakes, become pretty critical. So what does this mean for the public boarding school model on a national level? Number one is I think we're winning the theoretical battle. For those of you who had a chance to see the 60 Minutes piece that aired last year, you'll see that many people are talking about this. It's becoming something that people are comfortable discussing. The president has visited our school, a number of other dignitaries. And then Secretary Arne Duncan has been Education Secretary Arne Duncan has been very clear that the boarding school model has to be part of the solution set, that it needs to be part of the offerings that we have. And the theory holds up. Now the question really becomes the practical challenges. How do we get these dollars, right? How do we get better about not only dealing with the operational challenges, but the money to operate the schools, right? The cold, hard truth that I have to deal with is seed schools cost more than day schools. So how do I convince people to be able to give $35,000, $36,000 per student per year rather than the amounts that are going right now? One thing that we can do is start to figure out how you transfer dollars rather than simply trying to create new dollars. And so the slide that I show you here, which is very specific to Florida, because we're right now one of the states that we're engaged in is Florida to try to start a seed school in Miami, is understanding that there's these silos of public assistance and significant dollars that go to serve exactly the students that we're serving. And how do you free them up? You see dollars for TANF, child care, SNAP, or food stamps, Section 8. And when they total them out, you have about $20,000 to $22,000 that goes for the students that we're talking about. How do we try to redirect some of those dollars and then tie it in with some of the academic dollars? So that becomes part of the argument. Part of the argument also becomes ROI. But frankly, legislators don't work on a return on investment basis. They work on a cash flow basis. And so part of this has to be, how do you in the end make up the case for this? And so I think that where we go is, frankly, the federal government. Because these dollars, even though they flow into the states, are really federal dollars, right? The one set of dollars that's not even on here is HUD vouchers for housing, right? A $34 billion pool of funding for many families that are just like ours, that are in subsidized housing. How do we start to loosen the strings on those dollars to be able to redirect pieces to be able to support more urban public boarding schools. So that's where we're headed. That's what we're trying to do over the next few years. Start some of these schools one-off, as we've done in the 2 cities where we are right now, and in Cincinnati, Ohio, and Miami, Florida, where we have projects. But also trying to loosen the strings in such a way that you can create funding spigots so that more entities than just SEED are in the field of public boarding schools. Because in the end, competition in this field is actually going to be even good for us. We'd like to get other providers playing. We'd like to get other entities trying to figure out how to do this better. So in closing, I'll come back to science. In science, innovation, discovery, theories are constantly tested, tried, tweaked, challenged. And that's what we're trying to do at SEED. We had a model that we had theoretically in 1997, started to develop operationally in 1998, and over the last 14 years that we've tweaked, changed, improved, worked to try to get better and better. And though we don't have everything right, I know that we're on the right path, and trying to figure out how you can start more of these schools will only help us do that better. I know all of you are involved, right, in the pursuit of questioning, of seeking answers, and I really appreciate that as we all look for new inventions and trying to figure out how in the end we can improve children's lives. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the session.